Good afternoon. Welcome back to Storytime. It is good to have you all back again as we continue our story, Too Much Salt and Pepper by Sam Campbell, Chapter 10, The Sweetest Story Ever Told, The Importance of Right Attitude. This was now the third day of Carol's visit to the sanctuary, and there were two ominous promises written in the morning. Salt had disappeared again, and we knew only too well what that meant. Then there were leaden gray clouds reaching from horizon to horizon. We knew what that meant too, and we made ready for a rainy day. In the North Country, in every season, there are days drawn at random from the whole year. There is always the day in spring when autumn winds howl among newborn buds. Temperatures will dip alarmingly low, and we draw close to the great fire with the feeling that things may have gone into reverse, and winter may be backing up on us. There is a day in every winter when summer pays a surprise visit, a day in every summer when winter returns the call. In autumn there are times when the spring light is so noticeable in the sun that the flowers seem half inclined to bloom again, and birds recall parts of their songs. This was one winter day in summer on which we found ourselves faced with a day of cabin confinement. Gray clouds settled low over the treetops as if to take better aim with their rain. The deluge of drops they released seemed half-hardened by the cold wind that whipped them about, scattering them over the forest. Mother birds hovered over precious eggs and delicate nestlings. Deer crept back under umbrellas of massed cedar trees. Squirrels held to tree-hollow homes. Ground animals sought the dark, damp comfort of their caves, there to snooze the difficult day away. Jenny and I have loved this sort of a fireside day. It brings out the rich joy of hut happiness. But Carol had not yet learned its appeal. At first sight of it she was not too pleased. Her eyes were a bit wistful, her thoughts wishful, as she looked up in vain for a break in the clouds. Nature happiness to her was still symbolized solely by going and doing. She had not found that there is joy in just being. So much had been promised for this day. We were to search the cedar swamp for belated blueberry patches. We were to begin the marking of a new trail. We were to make special pictures of Salt and the chipmunks. But Carol, this day is an opportunity, I said, noticing that she was struggling with a sense of disappointment and frustration. What a time to write letters and read books. To play some music, bake something, rest, and just be lazy. Carol smiled pleasantly, but she wasn't convinced. I continued my good cheer propaganda. We'll keep that great fire roaring, Carol, and before the day is done, we'll broil over the coals, we'll cook potatoes in the ashes, we'll brew coffee, and we'll pop corn and toast marshmallows. Suppose you learn to bake muffins. Jenny will teach you today. That's an idea, burst out Carol, the sparkle of enthusiasm kindling in her eyes. I'll bake muffins for dinner. But, she hesitated for a moment, will you promise me something? I awaited her request, quite sure that the promise would be made. Carol suddenly became quiet and serious. Once at a lecture I heard you tell of an experience with a beaver. It was one of the most beautiful adventures I have ever heard. When you were telling it, I wished I might hear it again. But the next time, before a campfire or great fire, where I could really feel the scene you described. We will have the great fire tonight. After dinner, when we are sitting there, would you... When my promise was given, Carol's spirits rose. Of a sudden, the world was abounding with interest and things to do. When the hour was right, she headed for the making of those muffins and ran straight into the arms of Calamity. Her first quest was for a large pan in which to mix the dough. She remembered one that had been used for this purpose. The pan was kept on a high shelf on her little back porch. During her short visit, Carol had evolved her own way of getting it down from its high perch. She could not reach it, and she did not want to take the time to bring something to stand on. Such methods would have been much too conventional for Carol. So she would make a run and jump high in the air, snatching the pan off the shelf before she touched the floor again. It was all wonderful fun, and had been a most successful maneuver heretofore. However, it was not so fitting under present conditions, for unknown to Carol, Jenny had been making some simple syrup for use in canning, and had left it in this pan. When muffin-making time was at hand, without waiting to ask, Carol ran to the back porch, executed her ballet jump, and pulled the pan off the shelf. The weight of the syrup made the pan slip from her fingers. Carol landed on her feet all right, but the pan landed on her head, upside down. fitting like an oversized helmet. The thick syrup flowed all over her, in her hair, down her neck, over her clothes, and into her shoes. Jenny and I heard the crash and the scream that attended the calamity. We looked through the door, and for a moment were so dumbfounded we could not make a move to help poor Carol. The picture we looked on will always remain vivid in our memories. There stood the child in the midst of a sticky, slippery puddle, the pan completely covering her head and neck, the syrup pouring over her as if she were a pancake. Our potential spasm of laughter was held in check for one inquiry. "Are you hurt, Carol?" "No," came her voice from beneath the pan, sounding as if she were talking into a rain barrel. "Not a bit, but I'm horribly mortified." Then, while rescue work went forward, laughter shook the cabin. There were rumbles of thunder outdoors as if the clouds were snickering too. Carol herself was wonderfully good-humored about it all. I can't imagine anything that would try a disposition more than a syrup bath. It took several hours of scrubbing before Carol and the entire back porch were restored to order again. When at last things were somewhat normal, and Carol sat before the fire drying her new washed hair, we asked her if she still felt like making muffins. "I'll make them if it's the last thing I do," she replied with a stamp of her foot. And make them she did. Under Jenny's tutelage, she did a wonderful job. The muffins fitted well with the broiled meat in the fireplace, the coffee, vegetables, and dessert Jenny had prepared. As we sat at dinner, looking out at the darkening forest world, the rain still driving in sheets before an erratic and fitful wind, we spoke with gratitude of the sense of home comfort that crept over us. This feeling of contentment was deepened when, with dinner tasks completed, we gathered before the fireplace. Jenny sat in a comfortable chair, knitting a warm garment that someday would be worn by a soldier in a distant land. Carol sat on the floor at Jenny's feet, looking meditatively into the dancing fire. I brought in more wood to keep this home fire burning. "And now, young man, how about your promise?" asked Carol. "Yes, my promise. We were to repeat the beaver story, which I regard as my most precious wilderness adventure. Not that it excels in excitement, or even has the thrilling qualities which the word adventure might imply, but rather it uncovers so much about the nature of creation, and implies something of our obligations toward living things." "All right, Carol, you shall have the story. In it we shall find our nature lesson for the day, a lesson which must be summarized in one word: attitude. It is a fact, Carol, that much depends upon our attitude. This round old world is like a mirror that reflects back to us our own image. If our attitude is right, if there is kindliness in our hearts and in our ways of living, we see that which is kind and beautiful in the world about us. And if the world seems to be filled with meanness, cruelty, and lacking in intelligence, we may be sure that our own thoughts are made up of this pattern. I have not always had adventures like the one with the beaver. This beautiful part of nature was concealed from me for years because I had not learned that the key of kindliness opens the door to leading to such experiences. Some years ago, when I had first learned to love the life of creatures and no longer wished to harm or destroy them, a companion and I were traveling in the Canadian canoe country. Always seeking remote and undisturbed places, we held away from beaten paths and popular routes. We worked our way far beyond the end of the roads, deep into a lake-speckled wilderness. One day, we had made a long and difficult journey. Many portages and miles of paddling lay behind us when, in late afternoon, we came to the shore of a lovely little unnamed lake. We were so tired, we decided to stop there for the night, even though there was no spot very favorable for a camp. We searched around a bit, however, and a little way back from the lake shore, among some red pines, we found a space for our tent. It is marvelous how quickly a pitched tent becomes home. When we arrived, this spot was just another place in the woods. Now that our tent was there, our sleeping bags inside, it was home. Dinner was hurriedly prepared and eagerly eaten. Then, after preparing our camp for the night, we went to bed. My companion was asleep almost as soon as he had crawled into his sleeping bag. He had a marvelous ability to snore. It seemed to me his eyes could hardly have shut when the sounds arose that would suggest a sawmill and a zoo had suddenly been established in that tent, with the saw being fed and the animals not. This was a nightly event in our camp. I laughed a little at the vocal monkey shines that were going on. A flying squirrel lighted on the top of our tent, and I followed his path as he scampered across the canvas and went off into the darkness. Through the tent door I could look out into the loveliness of the night and see the silhouettes of trees with stars studding their tangled hair. In mind I was reliving the events of the day and planning the steps of tomorrow. Then I came to realize that I was in the grip of that strange and wholly enjoyable mood of wakefulness, which is known to all men who live in the open. The time comes when there is no such thing as sleep. Forest rangers, naturalists, voyagers, lonely sheep herders, dwellers of silent and remote places all know this experience. It isn't insomnia, nor that nervous wakefulness sometimes experienced by those living under the strain of city life. It is simply that life is too full for sleep. Sometimes seems to be more than that. It is a happy conspiracy in nature to keep the chosen one awake and prepared for adventure. This experience has come to me often. Sometimes it begins in the middle of the night, sometimes in the early evening. Always it holds me under its spell until daybreak. Strangely, there is no tired feeling as an aftermath. It is in no way distressing nor exhausting. In the midst of it, I have felt as if this were a new way of living in which sleep no longer would be needed. The whole experience is pleasant and desirable. Hence, when I found myself in the grip of this spell that night on a little Canadian lake, I welcomed it. I rose, dressed, and stepped out of the tent door into the night. Everything in the pulsing ebony mansions about me breathed life, beauty, and infinite silence. That is, everything except my companion, who at this time injected some new noises into his snoring, sounding as if the saw had struck some hard knots, and the animals of the zoo were on the verge of starvation. Looking for quieter surroundings, I moved among the trees toward the little lake. Starlight was sufficient to outline all things in silhouette. I found a moss-covered log at such distance from the tent as to reduce the snoring to a minimum, and there I sat down to enjoy the mystery and loveliness of the forest. The cool night air was a luxury in itself, and I drank deeply of it. Trees dipped with dew. Through the tree trunks I could look out at the still lake. Its quiet surface looked like polished black marble. In it lay the reflected image of the heavens and glorious in mellow starlight. But even as I watched out over those waters, I noted a little disturbance at the far shore. Some creature was starting to swim out into the lake, heading my direction. Whatever it was could be traced by the moving V of its wake, rocking the reflected images of the stars. I watched closely, realizing that the little disturber of the waters was likely a muskrat or a beaver. I hoped it was the latter because of my deep interest in these animals. I did not definitely identify the creature until it had crossed the lake and stood in the shallows not far from where I was sitting. Excuse me. Then it went through a series of moves that left no doubt. It paused, rose on its hind legs, shook its fur free of water, then it folded its little front feet to its breast, swaying from side to side, reaching its sensitive nostrils high and testing the atmosphere to see if danger were present. This, then, was a beaver. Often I had seen these animals do this, so that even in faint starlight I recognized the gesture. Apparently satisfied with conditions, the little engineer of the wilds began walking slowly into the woods in my direction. I could make out his course plainly, though he seemed more like a moving shadow than something solid and real. After walking a few feet, he paused again and went through that silent, patient motion, rising to his hind feet, folding his front feet to his breast, testing the air with his keen nostrils. He came on to within 6 feet of me, where he suddenly stopped, aware of my presence. Here he repeated the act of precaution. Oh, this was a grand adventure. To have this shy little fellow standing there almost within arm's length made me feel that in some involuntary way I had qualified for the confidence of nature. It seemed as if I were no longer an outsider, no longer an intruder, but now one of nature's family trusted with her secrets. The beaver stood very still, looking intently in my direction. Then 2 sounds broke out in the solitude which engaged his attention. A loon flew over, so low that the whistle of its wings could be heard. The beaver looked up, but showed not the least bit of alarm. An instant later, from far, far in the distance, came the cry of a wildcat. At this the beaver was all alertness and attention. He faced about in the direction of the cry. Here was the voice of his age-old enemy, the one of whom he must be wary. Through long generations, while his kind had been living in the forest, building their dams, forming their houses, Organizing their remarkable community life, the wildcat had been a constant threat, an unending danger. Sometimes a big beaver has been able to defeat a wildcat in combat, but usually the victory goes to the latter creature. Hence the beaver has learned to seek the safety of deep water when this enemy is at hand. That night I feared the wildcat cry might bring an end to my adventure. The beaver stood for several minutes listening into the distance, ready for flight into the lake. But the cry was not repeated, and finally the beaver lost his concern. Once more he turned his attention to me. Then came the climax of the adventure. The beaver was walking toward me once more. He stopped at my feet and looked me over carefully while I sat as still as I could, though I was trembling with excitement. Suddenly my little wilderness friend rose on his hind feet and placed his front feet against my hand, which was cupped on my knee. He lifted himself up and looked right into my face, his little twitching nose so close it nearly touched mine. I have never been able to describe properly the way I felt during this experience. There was something surprising about it, and yet at the time it felt wholly natural, even though unusual. In that brief moment there was the feeling that this was reality. This was the actual nature of things to be seen when we are free of fear or the wish to kill or harm. How long the little fellow remained in this position I do not know. It may have been for several minutes, perhaps longer. It is rather hard to count time in the midst of such an event, and I must confess I was about as excited as I have ever been. Finally I began to talk to the little creature. It is well to talk to animals. They may not know the meaning of the words spoken, but I am convinced they know from the quality of the tones and the manner of speech if they are near a friend or not. "Hello there, Amik," I said, using an Indian name for him. "This is decent of you to come to me in such a friendly manner. After the way we human beings have treated your people, you are more forgiving than most of us humans would be, I am sure." The beaver looked interested and reached his inquisitive nose a little closer. I continued. "It is a credit to you, old top, a mark of intelligence. Know that I love you and all your fellows in the forest. Else you would not trust me this way." Still he stayed on, turning his head from side to side as though trying to catch every word and to understand. You gotta see this picture here. It's amazing. After a time, he let himself down to the ground, turned and went unhurriedly toward the lake. He entered the water and swam back by the same route over which he had come. My last sight of him, or rather of the place where he would be, was as he ruffled the waters on the distant shore. No doubt when he disappeared into the woods. Next day, I searched the shore looking for his home, but there was no beaver house on that lake. Somewhere in the forest vastness beyond, in a stream or another lake, my little friend lived. But I did not find the place, nor did I see him again. "Are you convinced," said Carol, "that you had this experience because of your attitude? Because you had no thought of harming anything?" "Well, Carol, we must be careful in such matters not to get into the realm of mysticism. But I am sure that kindness is not just a mere sentiment. Kindness is science. It is part of intelligence. It quiets fear and releases right thinking and acting. One need only look within his own experience to realize that when he is treated kindly by his fellow men, he works better, thinks better, serves better, and feels better. This is notably true with animals. There is a fine side of their characters which is concealed by any form of cruelty. Fear floods their thoughts, and they cannot act with their full ability and nobleness. The dogs, cats, horses, and other creatures who live closest to us reveal this fact. One of these animals living under abuse has little opportunity to use his intelligence. Repeatedly it has been seen that animals taken from a place where they are mistreated and moved into an atmosphere of kindness change in disposition, showing plainly better character and disposition than was before revealed. So it is with forest creatures. I never saw the native friendship of the so-called wild animals when I was a killer of them. I never had experiences like this one with the beaver. It is a fact I accept without question that animals have a way of knowing your attitude toward them. One scientist believes fear in a human being gives off an odor which animals can detect. This odor of fear, he contends, produces fear within the animal, and makes him ferocious. This seems possible, though I could not know its truth. Another thought is that animals may instinctively feel the human attitude towards them. Certainly, even with our crude senses, we feel the attitude of people toward us. Know when we are liked and when we are not. One thing is certain in my experience: when my attitude toward animals changed, their attitude towards me changed too. Only after I had learned something of the science of kindness did I gain the friendships of the wholly enjoyable companionships of such creatures as Inky, Salt and Pepper, Rack and Ruin. I knew I would not harm them. I knew they wouldn't harm me, and they seemed to know all this too. The great fire had burned to coals now, and Carol went about preparing popcorn. Her thoughts still held to the beaver story. "What you say about attitude, does that apply with people too?" she asked. She was gathering the very lesson I had planned for her. "Yes, Carol, it does. At a college, a professor asked his class to write down quickly the names of people in their personal acquaintance whom they disliked. Some students had difficulty in thinking of any. Others could think of one or two, while a few listed a dozen or more. And it was found that those who disliked the most were themselves disliked by the greatest number. It seems to be expected of us in this world, Carol," I said, "that we must look for the best, work for the best, believe in the best in order to find the best. That is true in nature and in man." The rain continued its torrents. It pattered on the roof of Carol's tent house as she went to bed, and as she bade us good night, she said, "I'm glad we had a rainy day." None of us had as yet gone to sleep, however, when the expected and dreaded event happened. Fweet, 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 the sound came out of the night from the direction of my neighbor's cabin. I tried not to hear it, but it was no use. Again it came. Fweet, fweet, fweet. Grumbling against the whole tribe of porcupines and their ancestors, I dressed to go on this unwonted errand. Rain seized upon this moment to come down with fresh vigor. As I passed the tent, flashlight in hand, I heard Carol call to me. "Is Salt over there?" she asked innocently. "Yes, he is, the little scamp." "Remember now," she cautioned, "keep a right attitude." In my thoughts, I just said, "Ah, balsam juice." Chapter 11. Tomorrow is an odor with a stripe down its back. Hope you can join us again tomorrow. Have a wonderful afternoon, and God bless. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.